Hey everyone, thanks for watching. A big shout out to our subscribers. You're the reason these chilling stories keep going. But here's the thing, only 10% of viewers are subscribed. If you enjoy the content, hitting that subscribe button helps more than you know. It takes just a second, but it makes a huge difference. Don't forget to like and share to keep the chills spreading. Thanks again, you made this possible. See you in the next one, if you dare. I have presided at more burials than I would ever dare to tally, yet none of them becomes routine. Each funeral bears its own gravity, a particular ache that rearranges the air around it. Whenever I take my place at the graveside, I know I am stepping onto ground where faith and grief stand face to face, and neither blinks first. The church assigns us the duty to commend the dead to the mercy of God, to console those left behind, and to keep both the spiritual and the civil order intact over the rites of burial. Those words sound tidy on paper. They feel heavier when you carry them into the open air. Our Lady of Mercy Cemetery sits on the northern edge of Magnolia Ridge, Louisiana, just outside the parish line where the live oaks spread their arms like old choir directors, and the roadside ditches collect summer thunderheads in their reflections. I have served here long enough that I know the pitch of the wind when it drags through the Spanish moss and the way the gravel shifts under pallbearers' shoes. The cemetery has a rhythm, and funerals fit themselves into it with a kind of inexorable dignity. The procession leaves the church. Headlights move in a slow river down County Road 17. The hearse turns through the iron gate. Families tighten their ranks without anyone instructing them to. The cemetery crew has already made their quiet preparations, sod rolled back, vault lid set aside, straps strung across the lowering device, tents staked when the sun is too cruel or the rain too quick. We keep ledgers the way sailors keep maps. One is in the rectory safe, and one is filed with the diocesan office in Baton Rouge. Every plot is numbered, each vault carried a permit for interment. Every exhumation, rare but not unheard of, requires signatures, notarizations, and a chasing of paper between the county registrar and the cemetery committee. Our parish administrator, Mrs. Yvonne LeBlanc, keeps everything straight with a sharp pencil and a fiercer memory. She calls it stewardship. I agree. Families do not only entrust us with prayer, they entrust us with order. The God of the living can handle our chaos. The bereaved should not have to. On the morning I am thinking of, the sky wore that done-with summer look Louisiana gets when August finally surrenders. The heat was still there. Of course, it lingers like a last guest, but the light had softened, and the breeze carried the first hint of something merciful. The funeral mass had been for a woman named Etta Savoy, a school librarian for 30 years, quick to shush and quicker to smile. The church had filled with children grown into parents, with former students who could still recite their multiplication tables because she had made them practice in sing-song. We told the truth about hope in a room that still remembers how to listen. Then we drove out. At the graveside, people gathered in a measured semicircle, the way mourners always do. You could chart a family tree by how the hands found one another, spouse to spouse, sibling to sibling, a grandchild held by both parents at once. The cemetery crew, Walt Pritchard and his 2 sons, stood a respectful distance off, caps in hands. The casket had been placed above the opening, resting on the straps strung neat and parallel, its polished surface catching the oaks in the sky and offering them back in a darker tint. A green mat framed the mouth of the grave so the soil beneath would not stain anyone's shoes. The vault lid weighted to the side, concrete smooth and indifferent. I stood with my ritual book open, thumb marking the place from use, rather than from any need to find it. Funerals teach you the words by heart, but they also teach you not to trust your memory when grief is close enough to fog your thoughts. I took a breath. I looked at the family. In the quiet that always precedes the first prayer, I could hear small things, a child's shoe scuffing against a chair leg, the tentative sigh of someone who had been holding their breath too long, a mockingbird testing out its repertoire from a fence post. I lifted my eyes to the casket and began. Dear friends in Christ, our help is in the name of the Lord. It happened then. Not loudly, not theatrically. A whisper, close enough to graze the back of my neck, spoke my name. Father Nathan. No more than that. 2 words, a faint exhale shaped into syllables, a softness so near that my skin reacted before my mind did. My hands did not shake, not outwardly. The book did not slip, but I stopped, because stopping was the only honest thing left to do. You cannot speak over a voice that has just spoken your name without first acknowledging that you heard it. Around the semicircle, heads turned with the same small, startled choreography. Eyes thinned, searching for a mouth that had moved. No one's lips were parted. No one was close enough to me to make it a trick of proximity. The sound had not come from the gathered mourners at all. It had risen from behind me, from the direction of the casket. Training does not prepare you for whispers. Training teaches you steadiness. So I leaned into that steadiness like a man leans into a rail on a rolling deck. I closed the book on 2 fingers so I wouldn't lose my place and let a breath widen my chest. "Let us continue in prayer," I said, because there was nothing else to say that would not either feed panic or trample on reverence. The family went still, in that way people do when they are facing something they cannot interpret and have decided they will not flee. The mockingbird fell silent. Even the moss seemed to settle. I opened the book and read the words the church has given me to read. I commended Etta's soul to God. I asked mercy for all of us who still had to wake tomorrow and face a world small enough to set a table and big enough to hold our empty chairs. I blessed the ground with the sign of the cross and with water that had been poured into the font at Easter and now shone on wood in the sun. I traced the sign across the casket and across the air, my arm moving on the familiar hinge of duty and belief. Words carry a person across a threshold when feet cannot. The straps creaked. Walt and his sons took their practice positions and began to lower the casket, slow and deliberate, as if gravity itself had learned good manners. A white lily fell from someone's hand and left a wet mark on the varnish before it slipped away into the shade below. When the casket touched the vault bottom with that soft final knock you can feel in your teeth, the lowering device sighed. The family moved, not leaving yet, but rearranging themselves into the position that allows goodbye to become past tense. One by one they took the carnations from the funeral home cones and dropped them into the grave. Some cried without noise, some put their fists to their mouths like they were keeping in one last song. All of them glanced at me as if some invisible thread connected whatever had spoken my name to the words I had just said. It is a look I have never learned to translate. When the family had gone, as families always do, back to food and photographs and the sudden practical problem of who will feed the dog, Walt stepped to me. Not quite asking, not quite avoiding. "You heard it," he said, not as a question. "I heard something," I answered, because simple sentences are the only kind that belong at the edge of a grave. He nodded. Folks heard it too, saw how they moved. We let the quiet arrange itself around us again. Workers in a cemetery become connoisseurs of silence the way sailors become connoisseurs of wind. I waited while the crew did what they must. The vault lid went on with the whisper of concrete on concrete. The straps came up hand over hand. All those inches returned to the reel with a faint clatter. The green mat pulled back to reveal the honest earth waiting for what earth does. None of us spoke about the whisper. Not because we were too frightened to discuss it, but because some things become larger or smaller in the telling, and neither outcome seemed helpful. When the last tool was put away, I walked the perimeter of the grave once, a slow circle that is as much habit as it is prayer. Then I knelt on the edge of the mat where my knee wouldn't leave a mark, and bowed my head. Why my name? In my work, I hear my name in every season of life. It is spoken by parents above a font, by couples with hands linked at the rail, by men who have used up their courage and need to borrow mine for 10 minutes in a confessional. Children shouted across a parish hall with the full conviction that adults exist to answer. The hospital night nurse says it softly with a clipboard in her hand. The man who mows the rectory lawn uses it like punctuation. Names wear different clothes depending on who says them, but a whisper behind me at the instant of committal. My name carried on a breath so close it could have ruffled the page. That is not something you file next to casseroles and committee meetings and the price of roof repairs. Legally, there was nothing to report. No breach of order had occurred. The right prayers were said, the right signatures had been obtained, the right procedures followed. The vault was sealed, the grave was filled, the record would be updated and filed where it belongs. If anyone from the county called, which they did not, I could have recited the facts without hesitation. Facts are the narrow roads we build to cross boggy ground. Spiritually, I wrestled. It would be neat to point to an explanation and end the matter. Wind can shape an illusion if it finds the right angle through leaves and tent flaps. The brain under pressure is a generous inventor. Grief speaks sideways sometimes, a name escaping a person who will swear they never said it. The mockingbird could have answered for all I know some long ago moment when a child spoke my name near its perch, and the bird cached the sound and gave it back on a day I least expected. The world offers plausible threads for nearly any tapestry. I considered each one respectfully. And yet, I cannot claim certainty about what the church does not certify. We do not teach that the dead linger to startle their priests. We promise resurrection and commend souls to the mercy of God, trusting in a faith sturdy enough to carry us through every kind of night. I have no new doctrine to propose, but I cannot deny what I heard, or the way the semicircle of mourners slid in their shoes like a flock shifting on a wire. My name was spoken. It was spoken from the direction of the casket. It was not loud, but it was not in my head. That is as far as I can go without stepping into a kind of attention-seeking that has no business in a collar. I told no one that afternoon. Mrs. LeBlanc asked the ordinary questions when I returned the key to the cemetery shed. "Everything in order, Father?" I said yes, because everything that could be ordered had been. She made her neat check in the ledger and moved on to advising a couple who'd stopped by about pre-need arrangements. The calendar demanded its own small obedience. I changed the altar cloth from white to green for ordinary time. I answered an email from the choir director about the psalm setting for Sunday. The rectory phone rang with a request for a letter stating that a person had been confirmed in our parish in 1982. The world has a way of marching on, even when something has nudged your understanding off to one side. Night made a plain of the cemetery and set the oak shadows marching. I tried to pray the liturgy of the hours by habit, but my mind tripped over the same thought each time. Why my name? As if my doubts had scattered marbles across the floor of my attention. I set the book down and allowed the question to be the prayer. I asked for the grace to hold mystery without turning it into theater and to honor fear without letting it drive. I asked to be kept from the arrogance that would insist on an interpretation and from the cowardice that would pretend nothing at all had happened. In the days that followed, I found small changes in my own posture at graves. Before the first prayer, I began taking one extra breath in place, a moment of stillness in which I reminded myself that I was not just a facilitator of a rite, but a witness standing on a boundary. I looked at the casket longer than I used to, not morbidly, but frankly, like a man greeting a neighbor he had seen 100 times but never really seen. Then I spoke. The words did what they always do. The families did what they always do. The workers did what they always do. But I carried with me the suggestion that the space between our sentences and whatever is finally true about us is thinner than I had allowed. Occasionally, someone will ask me whether I have seen anything strange in a cemetery, and they do it with that blend of mischief and dread people use for haunted houses and tall bridges. I tell them that cemeteries are not strange at all. They are the most honest places we visit. What is strange is how quickly we forget what they teach us as soon as the gate closes behind us. I do not recount the whisper to satisfy curiosity. I do not need it to become a story for a bonfire. I tell it now, here, because it still instructs me, and because not every instruction comes with a footnote. If you press me for an answer, what was it? I will say this: it was a reminder, spoken in a voice I cannot locate, that at the grave I am not the only one calling names. We call upon the name of the Lord. We commend a person by her name to the mercy of God. We speak the names of our dead aloud so that in saying them, we do not fall silent ourselves. Perhaps that day, the other side answered the custom. Perhaps it is nothing more than a trick of sound that refuses to flatten itself under my analysis. Either way, I am not poorer for having heard it. I went back to Etta Savoy's grave a week later, alone, just after sunrise, when the air was as cool as it gets, and the highway had not yet begun to hum. The ground had settled cleanly. The sod lay like a green quilt tucked in at the edges. Someone had come, her daughter, I suspect, and left a stack of note cards tied with string, the way librarians used to stack index cards. A fountain pen sat next to them, uncapped but still wet. On the top card, in precise handwriting without a tremor, she had written, "Thank you for teaching me to love words." I stood with my hands empty, and let that be enough. I carry the whisper with me the way a person carries an old photograph in a wallet. Not to show around, but to keep the edges of your life aligned with what matters. Now, before I speak the first prayer at a grave, I pause, I look, I breathe. I say inwardly, and without drama, "Lord, let me be steady if mystery passes near. Let me be gentle if grief spills over. Let me be honest if fear looks at me with someone else's eyes." Then I open my book. It has never happened again. Not like that. Wind shuffles tense. Birds rehearse stolen phrases. Leaves imitate footsteps with a talent that borders on malice. And yet sometimes, precisely at the moment when a family lifts its eyes to mine for the words that will carry them from this side of the service to the next, a peculiar hush falls. The kind that is not emptiness but attention. In that hush, I think of how close speech and silence live together, and how names are bridges that do not know fear. I do my work. I let the mystery do its own. Cemeteries are not quiet because they are empty. They are quiet because they are full. Full of stories condensed to dates, of loves distilled into gestures, of promises that have not run out of road. We try to keep them in good order so that the living do not stumble while they are visiting the truth. The rest, the inexplicable, the tender, the rare, passes through when it will. When it does, I hope to be the sort of priest who hears without haste, finishes the prayer without trembling, and remembers that sometimes, at the very edge of the grave, a voice speaks your name, not to frighten you, but to remind you that you are still held in the same mercy as the one you are commending. And when the last flower falls, and the last car turns out of the gate, and the oaks pull their long shadows back into themselves, I lock the chain, tuck the key back into my pocket, and walk home by the same road I always take. The whisper keeps pace for a while, and then veers off into whatever country voices inhabit when they are finished with us. I let it go. I carry it. Both can be true. I have served as a parish priest long enough to measure years by the sound of wind in headstones. In Ashford, Ohio, our parish cemetery, St. Bridget, sits on a slight rise just beyond a 2-lane road and a split-rail fence. I have tramped those rows in every season. July heat that presses the breath flat, the still crystalline hush after a lake-effect snow, the shuddering aftermath of summer storms that fling branches across granite like tossed broom straw. Consecrated ground is no sanctuary from weather. It endures the same sky as everything else. A cemetery has two kinds of order. There is the spiritual order, the prayers spoken, the rites observed, the blessing of the ground where we commend the beloved to God. And there is the order you can hold in your hand, plats and maps, deeds and permits, the maintenance ledger with its careful columns. Every plot at St. Bridget is tied to a parcel number in the county office. Every marker corresponds to an entry in our registers that live in 2 places, one binder in the rectory safe, and a duplicate filed with the diocesan archive in Cleveland. When a vault is opened, the record bears dates, signatures, and a permit number. Families entrust more than memory to us. They entrust compliance and competence. The trust is holy too. The night before the incident, a line of storms had bulldozed through Ashford from the west, throwing lightning like tossed chains and dropping rain in thick sheets that drummed our gutters into a frantic chorus. I slept little. The rectory is an old farmhouse, and old houses have ways of telling you when the sky is angry. By first light, the rain had stepped down to a fine, ragged mist. The air held that charged, metallic smell that follows lightning. When I stepped out with my keys and my battered cap, my shoes sank on the parsonage lawn. The storm had not been shy. After weather like that, we performed the same choreography. Our grounds supervisor, Dwayne Holloway, a quiet man in his 60s with a farmer's shoulders, walks the perimeter and checks fence lines. Volunteers from the cemetery committee move branches off lanes and take note of toppled vases. I always go as well, not because the crew requires supervision, but because a priest belongs where the parish bears wounds, even if those wounds are only fallen limbs and standing water. We have a maintenance log, a thick binder with numbered pages. Storm days always add ink to it. I took the gravel lane that splits the veterans section from the south slope. Flags, slick with rain, hung limp around their poles. The bronze markers wore shallow puddles like coins under glass. I paused by a name I knew, Staff Sergeant Emery Cole, whose funeral we had conducted in March, and made the brief sign of the cross. Farther on, water had collected in the low corners of the walkways. The sod gave softly, the way a stiff mattress does when it finally yields. It was on the west side, among older burials where sandstone meets granite and Victorian motifs still curl in the corners of markers, that my eye caught a stain. One grave sat a touch higher than its neighbors, as if the earth had swelled under the vault years ago and never settled flat. From the seam where the turf met the stone border, a dampness had spread across the soil. That in itself is not unusual. Rain draws secrets out of the ground, clay bleeds color, iron runs orange, and old flower wire sheds rust that drifts like watercolor. I have seen all that. But this stain was not the transparent brown of runoff or the rusty orange that comes from a fence post leaching into water. It was red. Not a painter's crimson, not theatrical, but deep, wet, unmistakably red. It spread with the slow, patient geometry of something seeping, not spilling. I stopped where I stood. The morning held its breath. Priests are trained to be careful with words, because words build scaffolding around reality. I did not allow my mouth to choose a word before my mind had a chance to think. The practical explanations celebrated their turns first. Sap from a root torn in the gale, some chemical reaction between aged metals and saturated soil, mineral staining exaggerated by the angle of light. Cemeteries are not laboratories, but they host more chemistry than their stillness suggests. Even so, when I knelt and leaned in, The color gathered in the shallow depressions of disturbed earth in a way that looked nothing like rust. It looked like the ground itself had opened a vein. I called over my shoulder for Dwayne. He came at an easy shuffle, rain jacket unzipped, cap dark with water. When he saw the stain, his mouth thinned. "That's no storm rust," he said. "Not the way it pools." He crouched beside me, sniffed reflexively, then shook his head the way men do when their bodies deliver old, sensible refusals. We did what our procedures require. We took photographs with the parish phone, wrote the date and time on a notepad, and logged the location in the maintenance book. Row W, Section 3, Lot 11. I phoned our parish administrator, Mrs. Hart, who knows which line to call at the county when we have something to report that is not a broken sprinkler. Our notes are not gossip. They exist so that if anyone asks, there is a record that men and women with responsibilities did the responsible thing. Families return to ground expecting that, should anything be amiss, someone will have seen, written, and acted. Transparency, Mrs. Hart likes to say, is just a clean window. It shows the truth from whichever side you're standing. We cleaned the window as best we could. There was no evidence of disturbance, no collapse, no animal digging, nothing that would suggest tampering. The grave belonged to a family named Mercer. Their mother had been interred there 9 years prior. We put the notes where the notes belong. Word travels differently depending on what it carries. A misplaced invoice trudges. A scary story sprints. Mrs. Hart reached the Mercers with the discretion due them. They came the next afternoon, a brother and sister in their mid-50s, and stood at a distance from the marker with their hands hooked in their pockets. I met them on the lane. I described what we had seen and what we had done. I explained that the grave was sealed, the vault intact, the records unambiguous, that nothing unlawful, improper, or even unusual beyond the stain had occurred. They nodded, grateful for the explanation, and yet unable to look squarely at the spot. "We'll go," the sister said, her voice soft as damp wool. "That's enough." They did not step off the gravel. They did not return again that month, or the next. For me, the unsettledness did not arrive with fear. It arrived as a weight I could not put down. The human mind files certain images where the easily accessible books live. You lift them without effort, even when you do not mean to read them. Each time I walked the west side after that morning, my feet wrote a wider ellipse around Lot 11. I did not cut across that square of ground. It was not superstition. It was a courtesy extended to the density of sorrow that seemed to gather there, as one steps around a sleeping child so as not to stir what need not wake. In my private prayer, I tried to do what I counsel others to do. Let the sensible explanations take the first chair. The red could have been mineral and light. Soil is not a neutral substance. It keeps a ledger of what passes through it. Rain unlocks old entries. We are prone to behold with story what science can write plainly. Likely, yes, and yet the image of a grave that appeared to bleed refused to be completely domesticated by reason. Symbol and sight had overlapped in a way I could not wholly separate them without tearing something delicate. Priests speak of blood often. The words tie altar and cross, martyrdom and mercy, sacrifice and salvation. We say them with care because they have been worn smooth by centuries of handling. A red seam in wet soil should have been easy enough to dismiss as geology, but it pressed the symbolic into my eyes as if the earth were illustrating a homily I had avoided giving. That beneath each cleanly cut stone lies not abstraction, but love compressed into grief. We seal the vault. The grief does not obey. I thought of the Mercers. How could they stand at the gravel edge and still feel as if they were in over their heads? The mind does not play fair with people who have already paid sorrow's fee. For them, the stain turned the place where they remembered their mother into a picture they could not bear. So they stayed away. I did not judge them for that. If anything, the fact seemed to absolve my own circling. Some patches of ground ask not to be crossed. They are not cursed. They are crowded. Weeks passed. Summer does what it does in Ohio, burns off puddles, browns the edges of lawns, then rains again as if to remind us the sky has options. The stain faded to nothing the way a bruise does, quicker than you expect and slower than you want. The maintenance ledger moved on to other entries. A cracked urn in Section 1, a leaning stone in Row D, a mower blade dulled by hidden wire. I did not forget, though my memory learned to stop interrupting every thought with its red bookmark. We did not exhume. There was no cause. There was no law that would have allowed it merely to satisfy curiosity or calm the mood of the parish. Besides, I suspected an exhumation would show nothing out of the ordinary, no breached vault, no horror made for a camera. Cemeteries are stubbornly ordinary places. That is part of their difficulty. The ordinary insists on itself even when hearts are breaking. I kept up my rounds. On humid mornings, I brought a small brush and a bottle of water to whisk dirt out of the recessed letters carved into old stones. You learn how tenacious winter grit can be by the way it hides in the belly of a G. That work is prayer in its own way, humble and exact and without applause. When I reached the west side, my steps slowed, as they always did, and I prayed from the edge. My prayers do not need to cross a boundary to be heard. Duane and I spoke of it rarely. He is not a man given to speech when silence will serve. Once, a week later, when we were adjusting a flag bracket, he said, without looking up, "Some things are just heavier. Don't mean they're wrong. Just heavy." It sounded like wisdom earned the way calluses are earned by work, not books. I nodded. We went back to tightening the bracket. From the pulpit, I did not allude to Lot 11. People do not come on Sundays to hear their priest speculate about stains. But I did find, as the weeks unfurled, that my preaching carried a new caution where grief was concerned. I allowed fewer neat bows to be tied around people's sorrows. The temptation to hurry sorrow toward a lesson is real, especially in a vocation that trades in words. The stain taught me to let certain sentences remain open-ended. When September drew its first cool breath across the fields, the Mercers returned on a Saturday afternoon. I did not know they were there until I recognized their car parked by the west lane. I did not intrude. From the rectory porch, I saw them stand side by side exactly where they had stood before, hands in pockets again, heads slightly bowed. They spoke for a moment, turned and left. The grass where the red had once shone was the color of grass. The soil looked like soil. The mind, however, carries images longer than the ground does. We keep the incident book because we must. The law asks for it. I keep another book in a place no one else can read. It begins and ends with prayer. That book bears entries like this one. Teach me to honor what I cannot explain without feeding superstition, to make room for mystery without manufacturing marvels. Keep me from the arrogance of easy answers and the cowardice of silence where care requires speech. A priest serves at a boundary that cannot be drawn on a map. He walks the line between human explanation and human ache. There are those who would have wanted me to assert that the ground bled, a miracle or a warning or a haunting. There are those who would have wanted me to insist the red was only iron, only clay, only optics. I could satisfy neither camp without lying. What I saw was red wetness spreading from the seam of a grave after a storm. What I felt in its presence was not fear so much as reverent reluctance. What it meant I can only say this way. It gathered symbol and soil in the same place long enough for me to recognize how thin the membrane between them sometimes is. Even now, I adjust my path a few steps wider when I reach row W, section 3. I pause where the gravel curves and do what I have done there since the day after the storm. I pray for the Mercer's mother by name, which I know because I have said it in the prayers of burial. I ask God to hold what the ground holds, and to keep those who visit from harm, not lightning or sinkholes, but the quieter harms, dread's loop, memory's ambush. Our task is to keep the cemetery orderly in both the legal sense and the human sense. Order in this work means making room for people to grieve without tripping over fresh fear. If you asked me for a moral, I would refuse you politely. Cemeteries are not classrooms. They are repositories of love's residue. They are quiet, not because they are empty, but because they are full of names and stories and the soundlessness that follows a last word. Sometimes, in that fullness, the ground appears to speak, a fissure of red, a sudden scent that reminds a widow of pipe tobacco, a wind that lifts a ribbon at precisely the wrong moment. We do not need to name these things in order to honor them. We need only not to trample them. As autumn settled, the storm softened. The maples out by the fence went to copper. I kept walking the rows. I kept the ledgers up to date. The committee debated whether to replace the north gate or refurbish it. We chose repair, which is a small parable itself. People came and went with their vases and brushes, their stories half-spoken, their handkerchiefs balled in fists. If I had been pressed to say what I had learned, I might have said this, that my steps in a cemetery are not only about getting from one place to another, they are statements of who I take myself to be. A man who will slow when the air seems heavy. A man who will stand beside instead of on top of. A man who will let silence be eloquent. There is one more thing. The week before All Souls Day, clouds gathered low over Ashford and the light fell to a pewter noon. I went out with a box of candle sleeves and plastic stakes to place at the entrance, where people could take what they needed for the vigil. By habit, I wandered a last loop past the west side. Nothing in the ground called attention to itself. Still, when I reached the bend and felt my steps begin their wider curve, I realized the change had become permanent. Even on dry days, even with grass bright and firm, I would make that arc. Not because the stain might return, but because I prefer to live as if certain ground remembers. It costs me nothing to honor that memory with 3 extra paces. This is not a story I tell to alarm or to seek attention for a parish that wants very much to be left to its simple prayers and ordinary business. It is only what happened, seen by eyes that have read many names and carried many families to many gates. If a lesson must be wrung from it, let it be a gentle one, that grief runs under our feet in channels we do not always see, that weather exposes what was already there, that faith, if it is to be of any use, must walk slow enough to notice what startles and resist the impulse to explain it out of existence. At dusk, when the town turns its lamps on, the cemetery settles into that peculiar quiet that is not absence but presence, differently arranged. The gravel cools, the last car pulls away. The wind fusses the maple leaves into a conversation no one translates. I stand at the gate with my keys and listen a moment longer than necessary. Then I lock up. The ground keeps its confidences. I keep mine. And the next morning, when the sun finds its way through whatever clouds are waiting, I will walk the rows again, carefully, steadily, with the respect due to places that carry more than they show. Sometimes, in that silence, the ground itself speaks. When it does, I try to be the sort of man who hears without haste, answers without noise, and leaves enough room around a grave for sorrow to breathe. I have walked St. Bartholomew Cemetery in Willow Creek, Colorado, more times than I can recall. The ground there seems stitched into the hem of my cassock. It trails behind me wherever I go. Some pastors feel most at home behind a desk or in a conference room, sorting budgets and bulletins. My steadiness has always come among rows of granite and grass. Names chiseled into stone steady the mind. They remind me who we served, who we commended, and what promise we hold like a lantern in the wind. There is a human order to a cemetery, and a parish order to it as well. The town clerk keeps maps of the property lines. The county recorder maintains deeds. Our parish office maintains duplicate burial registers, one binder locked in the rectory safe, one copy filed with the diocesan archive in Denver. Every exhumation requires a signed permit. Every transfer demands notarized forms. Every burial follows state law precisely. Paper trails and signatures make sure grief never has to argue with bureaucracy. But beyond the paperwork is the quieter work, the kind you cannot stamp or file. The gates open at sunrise, and by mid-morning, before the mountains throw their long shadows, visitors come and fold themselves into memory. They kneel with brush and cloth, washing winter grit from letters. They stand and speak to a piece of stone the way they once spoke across a kitchen table. If you attend to cemeteries long enough, you learn that silence is rarely empty. It hums with names. Of all our sections, the children's hillside has the gravest gravity. A priest learns to carry out funerals as a part of the calling. Death does not stop at the sacristy door, yet children's funerals are different. They bend the world at the wrong angle. You cannot reconcile a casket one person can lift with any tidy catechism. Fathers collapse into the shoulders of mothers. Grandmothers clutch rosaries until knuckles blanch. I say the words the church gives me to say, and still the soil seems to resist them. No priest leaves that hill entirely the person he was when he came. On a gray Thursday in late spring, I had just finished the graveside prayers for an elderly man who taught half the town to sharpen a saw. The service was simple, an honor guard from the Knights of Columbus, a handful of hymns everyone remembered by heart. My habit after committals is to walk the grounds before returning to the rectory. It is discipline, yes, and prayer, too. The walking lets me give the dead what words cannot always carry. I began at the veterans' wedge near the iron fence, where flags snap softly above bronze markers. I crossed into the family plots, where old ranching names appear in consecutive generations, time stacking itself like hay bales in a barn. From there, I turned toward the children's hillside, a gentle rise topped by a cottonwood that scatters its floss in June like false snow, the light dimmed behind a slow quilt of clouds. And then I saw it. Movement quick as a sparrow, low to the stones. A small figure darted between headstones, the blur of a child at play, weaving with that casual agility children possess when they know no one expects them to walk in straight lines. The glimpse was clear enough to be sure of size and speed. I could not claim it a trick of the corner of the eye. My first thought was practical, not mystical. Willow Creek families visit in clusters. Children get bored. Perhaps some boy or girl had slipped the grasp of a distracted uncle and decided to play tag with the wind. Responsibility keeps you sensible. Church grounds mean church liability. Care is both pastoral and legal. I followed at an unhurried pace, calling out hello, with the tone adults use when they are gentle but expect to be obeyed. That morning, a fine drizzle had passed, and the soil still wore its sheen, damp earth tattles on every visitor. I expected to find sneaker prints or the small crescents of a child's heels pressed into the softened turf. There were none. The grass stood unbruised, the tender blades bent only by the weight of raindrops. I paused beside a lamb-topped marker, where a tiny porcelain angel kept company with a toy fire truck. The air smelled of wet stone and cottonwood bark. I told myself not to let imagination boss fact around, and I listened. What reached me first was not words. It was laughter. Not raucous, not cruel. Quick, bright. The kind of giggle that ricochets down a parish hall after Sunday faith formation when a teacher cracks a harmless joke. The sound did not travel in a straight line. It hovered and shifted, as if it had slipped its anchor and drifted in a circle, refusing a single source. I turned once, then twice, trying to meet it head-on, the way you face wind. There is an instinct, formed by both vocation and temperament, that tells you not to rush toward the dramatic in such moments. You make the sign of the cross without showing. You feel for the familiar beads in your pocket. You measure the distance between what your senses report and what your soul is ready to carry. I know the names on that hillside. I have sung short hymns there with families who could barely stand upright through the last verse. To hear the high rattle of laughter among those stones pried something deep and tender open. I spoke the prayer my mouth knows, even when my thoughts are scattered. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. I did not raise my voice. I offered it as if setting a glass of water on a table for a thirsty guest. The laughter broke off, not like a door slammed, more like a candle snuffed by wet fingers. In its place came a silence dense as snowfall. A magpie on the fence post closed its beak. Far traffic, never loud in Willow Creek, seemed to pause between one bend in the highway and the next. Even the cottonwood stilled. I stood within that hush long enough to feel foolish, and then no longer foolish at all. When quiet thickens, you begin to hear your own breath and heartbeat, and their insistence reminds you you're still on the living side of the line. I moved slowly among the markers, reading names as if taking attendance. A boy who never made it to his first baseball season because leukemia pitched the faster ball. A girl with a middle name chosen after a saint her grandmother loved. Taken in a crash on County Road 14 before she could make her first communion. An infant I had baptized at St. Luke's NICU, with one trembling father's thumb touching the edge of the tiny cap. Each stone is a biography, a bridge to dates and a dash. The belongings families leave say the rest. On one grave, a crocheted lamb, its ears weather-softened. On another, a glitter pen was tucked under the vase, as if its owner would return any minute to finish a notebook margin. I placed my hand on each cool crown of granite, not to summon anything, not to test anything, simply to accompany what cannot be fixed. By the time I crossed back to the path, the sky had lightened a shade. No child had bounded from behind a monument. No scolded mother had waved an apology. There were no prints. There was no evidence of any person but me. Yet the impression remained as real as the damp at my cuffs. I returned to the rectory as I always do, by the gate, down the sidewalk past the lilacs, and hung my coat in the mudroom. There are two ledgers in our office that are as inevitable as the bills. One records sacraments, one records incidents. The latter is not for gossip and not for ghost stories. It is for noting anything unusual on parish property, security lights staying on, a gate found unlatched, or a storm branch damaging the fence. I opened that ledger and wrote a line as plainly as I could. Approx 3:15 p.m., children's section. No visitors present. Observed movement not accounted for. Grounds checked. No disturbance. I did not write laughter. I did not need ink to carry what prayer could hold. When a priest keeps something to himself, it is not always secrecy. It is often stewardship. People bring us their grief. They do not need ours braided into theirs, unless it helps them carry it. Had a parent of one of those children asked me that evening about the cemetery, I might have told them the grass was greening nicely. I would not have told them their child's hill had held a sound that afternoon that did not belong to wind. Still, I could not set the experience on a shelf and forget it. That night, I prayed the Liturgy of the Hours more slowly than usual. I read Psalm 27 and paused on the line about the land of the living. For once, the words did not tidy up anything. They simply rested like a folded shawl on the back of a chair. Available if I needed them, I asked, not for explanations, but for a faithful posture toward what I did not understand, to neither dramatize nor dismiss, to neither hunt for marvels nor hide from them. Weeks went by, baptisms, marriage prep, meetings with the finance council about shingles and snow guards, a food pantry day where the line looped past the rectory gate and volunteers learned the right way to stack canned beans so no one's bag tore. The cemetery greened into June. When I returned to the children's hillside, I did not go looking for anything. I walked as I always walk, hand to stone, name to prayer. This time, I added something I had not said before. Over the usual commendations, I spoke a quiet request. Lord, let the joy that belongs to these little ones be neither lost nor misunderstood. If it moves among us as sound or memory or mercy, let it rise toward you without being trapped by our fear. I did not expect an answer. None came, not then, not later. I never heard that laughter again, but absence is not the same as emptiness. From that afternoon forward, the hillside asked for a different kind of reverence from me. Not the superstitious kind that drapes mystery in tabloid words. Not the skeptic's kind that starves mystery until it dies. Rather, the reverence you offer a closed door behind which someone might be sleeping. Your hand holds the knob more lightly. Your steps know how to soften. Occasionally, on weekdays when no one is likely to visit, I bring a small brush and a bottle of water and clean the dirt that collects in carved letters. You discover how stubborn winter can be by the grit it leaves inside the loop of an E or the belly of a G. On those mornings, I often think about the ordinary order of our records. The deeds, the permits, the neat type, and how their purpose is not to chain sorrow, but to spare it from chaos. The human heart can endure pain. It should not have to endure confusion on top of it. I do not know what exactly moved between the stones that Thursday. It could have been a trick of light and focus, the rain, the shadows, a brain tugged by months of ministering in that square of ground. It could have been my own memory reassembling itself as sight and sound. Or it could have been mercy, permitted by a God who is neither stingy nor unsafe. An echo of joy allowed to stand briefly where adults are certain only sorrow belongs. There is a phrase parishioners sometimes use when they think they have brushed against something holy. It felt true, not provable, not dramatic. True. That is the closest I can come. What I heard felt true in the way laughter always does when it belongs to a child who has not yet learned to dim himself for the world's comfort. It made no claims, demanded no audience, and offered no trick. It moved like a swallow and vanished like breath on a mirror. In my first years as a priest, I worked hard to have an answer ready for every odd report delivered in a doorway after Mass. Footsteps in old rectories, lights flickering in winter storms, dreams that refused to stay in the night. I do not try so hard now. People do not ask for certainties as much as they ask for company, someone who will stand with them on a porch between what can be weighed and what must simply be witnessed. We stand there together, and we learn to nod at the space between. St. Bartholomew Cemetery does not look changed to anyone else because of what I heard. The gates still creak, the cottonwood still threads the wind with its pale fuzz, and then litters the path. The lambs fixed to tiny headstones still face the same direction, but when I climb the slight rise of that hill, I do so with a changed gait. I move as if carrying a sleeping child. I refuse to jostle. I do not do this out of fear. I do it because something delicate chose to pass near me once, and I prefer to be the sort of man who does not startle what does not mean harm. The older I get, the more I realize the priesthood is a work of holding places where opposites share a border. We stand daily between tears and hymns, between hospital corridors and baptismal fonts, between casseroles left on porches and the hunger those casseroles cannot answer. We speak of resurrection with our lips while our hands spread earth over someone's father. If we are lucky, humility teaches us not to turn that border into a stage. We tend it. We keep its fence mended. We let people cross it from one side to the other with as few stumbles as possible. If you ask me what I believe happened that Thursday, I will answer carefully. I believe I heard joy where I did not expect to hear it. I believe that did not negate sorrow, but braided through it the way sunlight sometimes threads rain in the same sky. And I believe that my task in the face of such things is not to label them like pinned butterflies, but to let them live, to let them go where they are going. Some sounds are not for us to keep. They are for us to notice and bless and release. On clear evenings, the last color lingers on the western ridge of the Rockies long after the town falls blue. From the rectory porch, I can see the crest of the Children's Hill, the cottonwood silhouette cut into that soft light. I think of hands I have held and names I have spoken, of stories condensed into dates and dashes, of parents who visit with voices that break and then steady. I think of the laughter I heard once and never again, and I pray the simplest prayer I know, that the God who gathers what we cannot keep will keep it for us, and that the day promised to every baptized child will not be long delayed. When the porch light snaps on, moths flutter to it in their small frenzy. I close the rectory door gently. Tomorrow, someone will come to the office to purchase a plot, or arrange a headstone inscription, or ask whether silk flowers are permitted in winter. I will answer questions. I will gather forms. I will keep the registers updated and the gate hinges oiled. And at some hour between the necessary tasks, I will walk the hill and place a palm on cool stone, and remember that the world is most truthful in the spaces between sorrow and hope, between the quiet of the grave and the promise that refuses to be silenced. Sometimes in that narrow country, something speaks. Sometimes it laughs. And sometimes, because we are lucky, we are near enough to hear.